I got in around the moneymaker era during the time where I would say we had caveman tools at best. I saw rounders. I got hooked. At the time, I was playing pitch, which is a game that is very different from poker, but it was the main game that we would play in my high school. There was a few of us who were already rounding, sophomore, freshman year, even $5 games. We would take that money and we would walk home and we would deposit it on Poker Stars and play Poker Stars 3-6. Just talking about this yesterday, this era where it was very exciting for us. We thought we were crushing. Realistically, we were just taking shots with very limited bankroll. So, I mean, looking back, it was a pipe dream. But that's how I got started. It was Poker Stars, cash games, some tournaments on the side. But I was just very inspired by the way that ESPN had covered the Chris Moneymaker World Series, and seeing the movie Rounders on top of that, which I was introduced to, around the same time. I think the combination of those two really just got me very inspired toward the path, and it just seemed like there was going to be more money in it than what we were doing. Originally, I would say I didn't have anything grounded at all. When I look back on 2005, which is really when I got involved, we had the basic tools. We had Super System. I was just watching the Doyle Brunson memorial yesterday, and I totally forgot about Super System, but that was actually one of the first resources that I really had access to. Probably the first book I read. You had Sklansky's books, and that was an introduction to me. But because I didn't have a very grounded theoretical framework, those concepts got very distorted in my mind, and so I understood them partially, which meant that my framework was really just a collection of distorted thoughts. So I think what ends up happening when that occurs, and I believe it occurs to most players to varying degrees, is that you end up developing your own strange method that keeps getting warped with every next cycle of variance that you go through. You'll have some baseline concepts that you're implementing. You'll also have the creative ideas that you think are good. And then based on whether or not your 50,000 hands goes poorly or well, you'll decide to change or keep things. I think this is the cycle that I found myself in. It seems very common for any player that doesn't hold themselves to regular database review, objective review, which is that you will just keep changing things, trying to make a change occur faster than it can realistically occur, because the feedback loops in poker are just longer than pretty much any other performance arena in the world. So you asked me my method, I would say it was very sloppy, but I couldn't see how sloppy it was because there was no good reference point for better tools available. That didn't come until 2015, really, when the solvers dropped. And at that point, I was coaching for Run It Once, and I was the first player and coach, which is, I think, is what made this statement more powerful, to stand up and say, I think we have a big problem here with how we're training players. I don't think that the solvers are helping. I think we're just complicating things. I think we need something simpler and something new. It might have been the first real accountable thing I ever did as a professional in poker, was stand up and say that. As a coach, I think people were able to respect that and say, okay, this guy's trying to take ownership over a big problem that's pervading the training industry. But I didn't really know what the solution was. I just knew that I couldn't be a part of it anymore in the way that it was going down. It was nobody's fault. It was just we weren't able to convey concepts in a clear enough way, in a practical enough way. And it was really bothering me. I was suffering from it as a player. There was this imposter syndrome developing every day, where it was just like, I'm supposed to go and teach this stuff, but when I take it to the table, it doesn't feel good inside. I know that I'm not actually implementing sound strategy. I'm rationalizing constantly. Addressing myself in that way lifted a lot of weight off my shoulders, and then it put me into this void where it was like, okay, so what's next? I've sort of cleared out the stress that was coming from being an imposter in this way and not wanting to admit how big the problem actually was. But what's next? Am I going to leave poker, or am I going to try to create a system that is able to analyze hands in a stable, objective way. That was really the big decision around that time for me. That would have been 2016. And I eventually decided to create Poker Detox through that inspiration of I just really feel like I love this game. And if there was a way to create a more stable, precise decision-making process, that would be something that I think I could really hold on to and honestly look my friends and family members in the eye and say, I play poker for a living and it's safe. That was always the feeling I was going for, that I could never really obtain through all the previous methodologies. I just didn't think it was reliable. And the more self-aware I became, heading into my late 20s and early 30s, the more clear it was to me that there were gaping logical inconsistencies in most of the methods that were being presented. And that's when I really, I think, woke up and said, I need to address this. I need to address myself. And I think I need to be accountable and say, I'm a coach. This isn't working. Let's decide if there's a path forward where we could find something better. This quote that I like, if something doesn't exist, you should be the one to go create it. And that was sort of the energy that I was holding on to that moved me forward during that period. I loved the game enough to risk another couple of years to see if we could stumble upon a new method. Data-driven strategies were born from that inspiration. It's probably the most common question we get from players who are peering in on our methodology. I'll approach it in levels because it's something that needs to be unpacked carefully. So the first thing the player needs to understand about a data-driven method is that the baselines are created by profiling a player into one of two categories, recreational or regular. The way that we bucket those players was designed from an analytical method that basically tried to capture the biggest imbalances of the pool and categorize them. So what we found out, which was not surprising, was that fish have many more imbalances than regs. And the deeper the hand goes, the more valuable those imbalances become to exploit. As a baseline, I think you could say that's pretty true. So naturally, what stemmed from that investigation was that we began to find reliable ways to bucket fish and regs. Through pre-flop statistics, mainly VPIP PFR, we were able to create the first real distinction between a fish and a reg, statistical distinction. We use a VPIP PFR measurement, specifically the gap between the VPIP and PFR seemed to be the main distinction that would allow you to classify a fish or a reg most efficiently. By efficiently, I mean presses out over the smallest sample. Obviously, there's other indicators that if you can add into the mix, they'll give you that reliable read faster that you're up against a fish. For instance, if you see the fish limping pre-flop, obviously that increases the chance that you're up against a fish even before you have any real significant hands played with him. But that's the first real thing you need to understand about how a data-driven strategy works. Is its first endeavor is to basically profile the player as a regular or a fish. Once you have that identification, you have a baseline strategy that performs against either of those types of players. So we typically play a max exploitative strategy against fish because fish do not know how to adjust. They're either unaware that they're being massively exploited or they're just incapable of deploying the accurate adjustment. Then against regs, the question is how observant and how capable are they? So typically what happens is you can beat people over the head with the same weapon at small stakes because the small stakes reg is naturally less observant and capable than a mid or high stakes reg. Specifically in known pools, you can still abuse small stakes regulars. But once you get into pools where the competition is tougher, we taper back the max exploitative, even moderately exploitative system all the way towards more of a min exploitative strategy. The min explo strategy was something that we proved concept with probably back in 2021, which was the first time a player on our private side had really crushed a high stakes known pool. Stefano Gennari, who was an Italian player at the time on our private side, used the strategy to beat PokerStars 1K&L for about 10 bigs per 100 adjusted over a large sample, which is a fairly high win rate. I would say maybe one of the highest we've ever seen. Steph left behind a document that outlined how he did that. And at first it landed in our archives and I didn't pay too much attention to it. It wasn't in perfect English. It was in broken Italian. Later on, I came back to it because I had been getting so many questions that were similar to the one that you asked of like, how does the strategy perform at different pools at different stakes? And I went back and I redesigned this document so that it would read in perfect English at a 4th grade level, basically. I wanted it to be extremely clear, hard to misunderstand, and I wanted to be able to deliver it to people almost as a compatibility document in terms of this is what you could expect if you were to train with Detox method operating in a known pool. So the document outlines how he adapted an MDA strategy to a known pool in a way that was probably more artistic than we had ever seen. And I think that's what's really appealing for players who still want to have control over their strategy and don't want to feel like they're getting a cookie cutter approach. This is how you do it. You adopt a mass data analysis strategy and create a hybrid approach that allows you to calibrate the frequencies of your exploits in order to remain disguised. Steph got very good at that art. He left behind this document. To date, it is the document that when somebody comes to us and says, I think I want to train with you guys on the private side, I say, you just need to read this. And if this makes sense to you, we'll move forward. Typically, when someone reads that, they either have a very good understanding. They typically, when somebody reads that, they know immediately whether or not they want to move forward with a data-driven system, specifically in a known pool, because it just resolves all the questions. And the beauty of it is I can feel good about giving it away because it doesn't give away the farm. He still needed all of the data in order to make sure that he could apply it to this framework that he had created. He just talks about how he calibrates his frequencies in a way that was more intelligent and disguised than we had previously had frameworks for. So that's the general arc of how the strategy looks when you're using it in semi-anonymous compared to known pools. The higher the stakes go and the more observant the regs are, the more you have to minimize the exploitative baseline of the strategy. Part of the reg observance is whether or not you're playing in a known pool or a semi-anonymous pool. Clearly, even at 2K&L, you can play a more exploitative strategy than you would be able to on PokerStars, because on Ignition 2K&L, that's what I meant to say, that is a semi-anonymous pool. They don't have permanent tracking on your statistics or your player name. So there's no perfect science to the art of resilience, which is the word that we ended up using to describe the art of tapering an exploitative strategy to the environment that you're in, whether or not you want to play with that dial of min to max exploit. There's no science to it. It will always be an art, but I do believe the players who can become the most self-reliant, I think is the right word, in navigating that terrain are the ones that have the highest potential. I'll add one more point here because it was the biggest thing that we noticed back in 2019 when we released the first public data-driven bluff catching product. Back when we were still selling public products, you might have seen a product called Ether. Ether was a bluff catching almanac. It had plotted many different lines, textures, nodes, where we had accumulated a reasonable amount of statistical certainty that the pool was either over bluffing or under bluffing in these nodes. Again, separated through the alias of regular and fish profiles, because you need to make that distinction in order for it to be useful. Once we sold this product, we had two very different types of buyers, and it became very apparent to us that there was a clear fork. There was the type of buyer who really wanted perfect information around every node, and once the smallest thing changed in the hand, they were immediately paralyzed. Perfectionism, neuroticism even. Then there was a different type of member that purchased that pack who seemed way more secure, relaxed. They could think more independently. They were clearer thinkers. They operated on grounded first principles. They were able to adjust to a change in the pattern when it occurred in real time without having a nervous breakdown, basically. And that's when it really stood out to us that with this type of system, we're really looking for players who have this skill set up front. We're looking for players who are not stuck in fixed mindsets, struggling with a lot of perfectionism. We're looking for players who can spot a pattern and extrapolate it. I think that was the word that my brother used at the time. That's how it registered to him. We were really looking for players who could use data and extrapolate on the patterns that we delivered in order to make good decisions when something changed. So that was a big wake-up call to us in terms of like kind of realizing that even though we had a great product, it wasn't a good fit for some people because they just weren't at a level where they were going to be able to really utilize it. It's funny, I have a joke that's really maybe not that funny if you're stuck in the small stakes situation, but I tend to say small stakes is the hardest limit to overcome. Not from a strategic standpoint, but from a logistical standpoint. Because when you meet a small stakes player, more often than not, in fact, I would say like 9 out of 10 times, that player is stuck at small stakes, not because they lack proper strategy frameworks, but because they're breaking down at a logistical level. This is also something that Pat documented diligently during his time as the head coach. 2019, 2020, I think, was when we really discovered this. We had a bunch of small stakes players on the team who were underperforming, and then there was a group of small stakes players who flew straight to high stakes. They all had access to the same content. They all had access to the same support. When we asked them what was going on, we got varying different excuses, I guess is the best way to put it. And it really confused us because we were taking what they were saying at face value. It was only when we really looked in to their situation and saw that behind the scenes, their life was in shambles. They didn't have a schedule. They weren't playing at the same time every day. Some of them didn't even have scheduled play and study times. A lot of them weren't putting in professional levels of volume. I mean, the joke, I guess, is that first you need to stop eating pizza for breakfast before you can expect to perform as a professional. And then the pushback there is, well, there's some people who don't have that stuff handled and they perform really well. And I would probably just call those players anomalies. So what we found from this whole phase was that we really needed to start to prioritize players who had their life more logistically handled first, because it seemed like it was more important for them to be able to grab onto the strategy and use it effectively than anything else. It seems very hard. I mean, to date, it's the main thing that I'm constantly on the lookout for when we contract a new player is I want to know what the inside of their life looks like. What's the day-to-day look like? How much pressure are they under with the other relationships and obligations that they currently have? Because it's the thing we can't overcome as coaches. If your life is not in order, if you haven't handled that baseline responsibility yet, it's going to be very hard for you to remain accountable to a high performance path. Damn near impossible, I would say. So that would be the number one thing I would say is blocking most players. It's usually a big blind spot that they have a logistical constraint, major logistical constraint. The second thing, which is more of a mindset constraint, would be that they're constantly in need of overcomplicating things. There's a joke, I guess there's a lot of jokes on the private side about this stuff, which is that I tweeted this 2 days ago because I actually saw it in a recruit's application. And when I saw it, I like immediately recruited this player. I'd never seen it put like this before, but he was giving an account of, past successes he had as part of his resume. And he said, I've done these things, I've achieved high performance in these other areas. And when people ask me how I did it, they're never satisfied with the answer. And I was like, we need that guy. because that's the indication that that guy is doing a lot of consistent basic execution that is massively undervalued by the low performing mind. The low performer constantly wants the secret. They want to overcomplicate things because it makes them feel like it might be, an inch away, when really the truth is the grind to high stakes is a very unsatisfying, slow pace. Often it just is. It's a big commitment. It's probably a 2 to 3 year commitment before you can really have any significant level of certainty that you're going to arrive there. So vetting for that upfront has become more and more important as the company scales and as we have more demand for applications for the private side. I really want a strong indication that someone has accomplished something in the past. And if you haven't, then I want a strong indication that you have enough self-awareness around what stopped you from accomplishing something in the past that you're ready to start a new chapter. It's got to be one of those two things. When I think back on like my rock bottom experiences, I knew that I didn't really have much proof in my past that I could really excel at a high level in something. Most of my past performances were riddled with like almost getting to the top, and then I would lose a big game and I would quit the sport. Like that was the arc of my journey, and like multiple avenues of performance. I remember like chess and baseball, they both took that path. So when I had a rock bottom experience in poker, I really had nothing in terms of a conviction to fall back on and say like, I can do this because I achieved the highest levels of these things before. What I did have was this emotional leverage where I could sense I had the potential and I was suffering very deeply. I just needed to commit. And there was a point at which I hit that real springboard of leverage where I said, no more. I have to get accountable to these areas of my life and stay as consistent as possible with the things that I know are going to map to high performance if I expect this to work out. So I think you need one of those two things. You either need to have hit some type of rock bottom emotional leverage point, or you have to have a conviction that carries over from having performed at a high level in some other arena in the past. If you have one of those two things, I feel very comfortable making a gamble on someone like that. If you have none of those things, I think you're up against a pretty significant mindset constraint that you need to resolve before you step onto a path where you're going to go play 500,000 hands and expect a result. Typically, it's all passivity. Pressing passive buttons too frequently. I would just almost leave it as that. You can imagine how many different ways that presents, but I just said this morning on social media somewhere that poker players are wildly unaccountable. Imagine spending thousands of hours running sims and never holding yourself to an objective database review where you could actually get feedback on what your true defense frequencies are. This is what's happening all over. This is what most poker players are doing. They are spending all of their time theorizing and pretending that they're gonna hit these frequencies that they're studying and aiming for. And then when the rubber hits the road, we look at a database and it's like you're overfolding all over the map. You're not even close. So something is breaking down in performance that's not mapping towards these frequencies that you're aiming for. This is typically the biggest blind spot, because once you add the real money effect into their execution, it does something. It makes them drift passive on average. There's a fundamental risk aversion that I think presents in the poker player that it's probably human nature. It probably has something to do with the pot odds model and the fact that if you want to play good poker, you're going to have to constantly be putting money in from behind in spots where you're not going to get positive reinforcement for a plus EV action. Meaning you are going to lose the pot the vast majority of the time when you're making a plus EV decision, a plus EV investment. I don't think the mind is really built to have that tolerance up front. It takes a very rare breed of player to be able and willing to go and do that without a lot of training. When I say go do that, I mean go play a strategy that's actually incentivized, that maps towards a solver, let alone going beyond those frequencies and exploiting the imbalances of the pools, which is kind of what we train for up front on the private side. People ask us, what does the first division of the private training look like? It looks like a massive overcorrection towards max exploitative aggression and bluff catching frequencies. What do you mean an overcorrection? What I mean is we're going to train you to beat people over the head relentlessly with a weapon that we know performs in a vacuum. And only once you move up to mid and high stakes are we going to taper that frequency back, because that's the only time it's going to become relevant for you to get more balanced. People say, are you telling me I can just beat people over the head with max expo strategies at small stakes? That's what I'm telling you. You can definitely do it versus fish at any stakes, and the small stakes regs are not quick enough, they're not intelligent enough, and they don't have the risk tolerance to combat it. On top of that, if you do it right, you're only going to be at small stakes for 100 or 200,000 hands, so by the time your opponents realize what you're doing, you're out of there anyway. Our COO on the private side is a very skilled golfer, and he introduced this framework that really ties in nicely to how we operate at training with these max exploitative protocols. He said, when a skilled golf coach is correcting your swing, they will exaggerate the correction so that once you sort of regress, which people always do, it settles back at the proper position. This is the approach we take to training at this stage, which is we want to just see that you can pull relentless triggers, because that's the skill set you're going to need to have once you're at high stakes. You're not always going to use it, but when it's time to use it, there cannot be any friction there. You need to be able to use it with conviction. So we break that. I would say it's like almost like a pocket that you have to break it in. You have to get that risk tolerance up early so that the player can actually rely on it at a later stage and know that it's been handled. Without it, problems. Player goes on his first downswing at high stakes, not having integrated a high risk tolerance. Suddenly he drifts massively passive. Can't authorize the triggers that need to be pulled, tailspin. So we really try to handle that up front. And I think it's one of the biggest things that our players are grateful for later on, but it takes a lot of frame setting, and like we make that expectation very clear. We're very transparent of what we're doing. It's like, this is not how you will play at later stages. It's just important right now for your phase in development. So maybe that's the most important part of the private side that we've really developed over the last year, is making sure the player understands the expectations at every stage and how it all connects to the total journey of where we're taking them. The full high stakes transformation. It's going to require certain skill sets. We've designed a program that gives you access to those skills in a certain order so that you can make as much money as fast as possible every step along the way. I think there needs to be a willingness in the player and availability before there can really be any potential for it. I don't really enforce mindset in the way that I used to. I still place very high value on it, and I'm very vocal about how important I think it is. But I do one of two things when I'm recruiting players or scanning for potential in players. I'm either looking for evidence that they don't have similar mindset constraints as many small stakes players have, so they've already overcome them through their own work, or maybe they just come from backgrounds where they didn't have to endure certain traumas that left them with mindset constraints. And then on the other side, I'm looking for someone who has a genuine willingness to explore. One of those two things is necessary in order for me to feel like the player has the potential to enter a real growth mindset and break out of a fixed mindset. As far as approaching it, if there is a genuine willingness, I just try to make myself as available as possible. Specifically on the private side, all the guys have my cell phone number. They all know it's okay to message me at any time if they need support. The higher stakes guys have unlimited mindset access to me, where we use WhatsApp voice notes, staying in contact as frequently as possible. Anytime they have a question or need reassurance about something career related, they can hit me up with a voice note, and it's my favorite way of staying in touch because it doesn't require that we schedule an international Zoom call in order to get you help. I wake up, I see my top players in the queue, some of them have questions, I can go for a morning walk and I could just like rip a response, and we stay in touch that way. And it has been probably one of the biggest drivers for strengthening our culture, I think, is that I'm back on the ground daily with players, just there for them and present. But I don't force anything. It's like, you can use this if you want, and if you want to open a thread and start pulling on it, I will take you to the root of it. I mean, for whatever reason, I have a very strong skill set of being able to sense where the root of someone's mindset issue is stemming from. Generally, I would say all roads lead to a lack of accountability over some aspect of their life. And as soon as I can spot it, I can help you start to unravel it, but only if you're willing. So I think it really takes that connection and trust between player and coach, where the player presents and says, I'm actually willing to explore this and I really want the solution. I genuinely want to be free from the type of suffering that this particular circumstance or perspective seems to be causing me. If there's that level of desire, I always feel inspired to deliver. Sometimes there isn't that level of self-awareness or inspiration, and there's just no real pull for me to offer anything. And it's very easy for me usually to see when we're not going to be able to make progress unless this player can access a higher level of self-awareness around what's going on. So cliffs are, I scan for the level of self-awareness that a player is at and the level of availability that they're presenting with, and I try to gear my resources and my attention towards those players. There really isn't a purpose for me in doing very basic mindset work with people who haven't already gone through a significant level of work through. I see my resources being more geared towards people who are already at sort of a baseline level of accountability, or are very available to being exposed as to why they can't reach that baseline. I like working with both.
That's all.
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned that. I was actually thinking about Solo back in the day. Yeah, he was one of the first true followers I had on Run At Once, and I want to say I gave him a free subscription to maybe one of my earliest products. I think he wanted or something. And looking back on that time period, what stood out to me was the amount of loyalty that developed from just the way that I built that first real following through Run At Once. I think it had to do with that blog. I was sharing very vulnerably, and I think I was really speaking to the struggle of the community at that time. I always think back on that and remind myself that's what you need to keep doing. Like, whenever I lose my way in terms of how I want to keep moving forward with the culture and the brand of Detox, I always try to anchor myself back at the energy that I was speaking from during that time, because for whatever reason, it seems to me that the most powerful thing you can do as an influencer in any industry is to connect to the struggle of the people in that industry. And I think that was something I was able to accomplish at that time. I don't think I was fully aware of how impactful it would be. I just knew, almost like it was therapy for me, I need to get this off my chest. The real question I was trying to answer, I think, is, does anybody else feel this way? Because no one was talking about it. And that's what was scary to me, is I was in a deep state of loneliness where I felt like nobody was suffering as deeply as me, confused as I was about the path forward in poker. And by opening up about it, you know, in the following years from that blog, there was dozens of times where people who I did not know would stand up, walk over to me at a live event, and put their hand out and say, the way that you delivered the information in that blog had a radical change on my life. And I was to put something like that out there and get that type of response, I think, is unique. I had never experienced that type of appreciation before. And looking back on it, the only thing I can think of is that I was sharing very vulnerably, and I was touching a part of people that hadn't been contacted. So I always remember that, and I try to hold myself to that standard with the content that I put out. When I am going to write something meaningful, instead of just a Twitter hard take, when I really sit down and I write my threads, I try to anchor it in that energy. I'm very long on the evolution of any industry, and I think that incorporates AI. I don't have a resistance to it in the same way that I think many people do. I am ethically against RTA. I think that lines need to be drawn. I do feel like there will be a need in the near future for almost like a roundtable discussion to occur with some of the population analysis experts in the community alongside some of the most reputable influencers. For instance, like I think of Galfond, he should be on that board. There needs to be a community-wide discussion of many of the top coaches and minds of the industry that finally set precedent on what is ethically okay in terms of mass data analysis and AI pushing into the industry. Currently, I see there being a lot of blurred lines. For instance, I'll just give one. So what we do with mass data analysis is basically scrape population and split it up into aliases. It's not weaponizing data versus any specific regular in the games. The next level of mass data analysis would basically be you give us a sample of 50 or 100,000 hands of a specific reg that you play with regularly, and we rip their database apart and give you all of the exploits that would uniquely exploit that player. This is a whole nother level of weaponizing information, and there's not really clear lines that have been drawn here. I don't know how I feel about it. I need some of my biases reflected back to me. I also have a pretty good sense that I could make a good argument that it's headed in that direction no matter what we try to do. Often I feel like the way this thing plays out is that there are concessions that we need to make because the evolution is just naturally occurring. And it doesn't mean the game is ruined, it just means the game has changed. I really think people hate to hear that because people hate change. And especially if you're stuck in a fixed mindset, the last thing that you want to hear is that you're going to have to get on your horse and change your entire approach in order to keep pace. So I'm aware of the collective bias that would make something appear unethical when really people are just afraid of change. I think that's strong in the community. I think it's strong basically everywhere in the world. I'm trying to think about it more objectively in terms of what is actually happening. What can we prevent? What should we try to prevent? And is our impulse to prevent something stemming from ethics, or is it stemming from an unwillingness to change? I think that's a key distinction that takes a decent amount of self-awareness and personal honesty to be able to distinguish. I could go into different forks with the conversation. I think RTA is clearly wrong. I think where our team needs to be putting more attention is drawing the lines of where mass data analysis trends into weaponizing information against specific opponents. For instance, there was a case recently that was covered by my friend Matt Berkey on his podcast, and it had to do with a heads-up match where one of the players in the match was exploited by the other player after that player had accessed his database through a previous coach, meaning a coach weaponized a database of a former student against him in a later heads-up match with a different opponent. Clearly, that's a line that should be drawn. I don't think there's any questions there that that's unethical. So there's certain stuff that's easy and certain stuff that's more difficult. Like, should it be possible that you could ethically obtain that player's database? I think there's a big distinction here too, that whole cards exposed and whole cards not exposed are two very different types of weaponizing. In this situation, the opponent had access to whole cards exposed because the coach delivered the entire database. So that's much different, I think, than, for instance, just buying hands from a third party where you don't get to see exposed whole cards. This is why I think it's a discussion for minds in the industry that are already capable of operating from significant nuance. Because in order to have this conversation intelligently, the first thing that you need to define is what are the actual limits of a data-driven strategy. Oftentimes, I think people exaggerate how powerful it actually is. They think it might just be some hack that as soon as you have it, you can just destroy with no real skill needed. It's not the case. It still requires a lot of integration in terms of, internalizing the data, understanding how to deploy certain exploits in real time, calibrating. It still requires the risk tolerance. It requires the fortitude to keep pushing through and implementing on something that you're not getting positive feedback on when you're on a downswing, all of these things. So in order for the conversation to occur in a way that's fair, I feel like the round table of influencers needs to first have a very clear view of what the limitations of a mass data analysis alias oriented system truly are. And once those limitations are clearly defined, then we can open up the discussion about how big of a threat this is if we extend it and push lines further down. So I don't really know where that conversation will lead. I think the thing that I ground myself in and feel good about is that I want to be on that board, and I want to actually be the one that provokes the need for it. Something I'll probably be speaking more openly about in the next 3 to 6 months, because I know that what I care about the most is that the right thing is done from a global sense, a community sense. And that doesn't mean that we protect people who are in victim fixed mindsets. It means that we choose the most objective choice for the evolution of consciousness. That's really how I see it. I see it through the lens of a unified field, and I don't want to prevent things from happening that I think are inevitable. I want to move the ball forward in any way that I can in any arena that I'm included in. So what will come from it for me is a new level of accountability where whatever that group decides, assuming we can come to a compromise of sorts, I will hold those lines, and I will do it fiercely and accountably, even if it means that it hurts my bottom line. Because there are things that I could do unethically that would make a lot more money. I don't want to cross those lines. What I want to figure out with a team of intelligent minds in the industry is, where are the lines that we haven't set yet? Where are the lines that we haven't had incentive to set yet? Because we are pushing the frontier of mass data analysis, and it is time to really draw these lines, not with arbitrary, site software VPN type boundaries, which don't make any sense. And I'll just go on record, I think, with most of the coaches in the industry that say that's just absurd that those still exist. Let's create some real meaningful boundaries that are informed from some of the top minds who are in the arena of data analysis and actually pushing the edges of it. So that's my stance. And as far as botting and actually like unleashing bots against humans, firmly against it.
It's a big subject. I have many problems with a lot of people who are thinking that MDA is I don't know his name in English. Sorry, Patricia. It's sorry. Okay, yes, that's exactly what you're saying. I was thinking about different formats, and if you're interested in PLO in heads up too, and if you are working on that with MDA and in the same way that you are working on cash gain and MTT, you have done it in heads up and PLO.
We currently have not explored MDA for PLO, and I would say it's only because the demand just hasn't been there yet. I think it's growing.
Oh, yes.
A lot of my job at this point on the private side is just about me keeping an ear to the ground and doing regular calls with the players to see what type of consumables they'd be interested in the future. And PLO has come up as a potential fork that we would be polarizing into for second term offers, even first term offers, honestly. But that type of stuff, it's always a timing thing. It's always about finding a right fit. It's always about finding enough hands too. just in general, I think less hands are played at PLO, so it could be just harder to acquire enough data in order to arrive at enough statistical certainty with the findings. These days, though, I would guess you could get a couple 100 million hands on PLO pretty easily, and they'd all be relatively recent. This kind of calls back to a question that you had asked earlier that I didn't really come full circle on, which is how do we make sure that the data is all up to date? We keep updating it. I think we just did a pretty expensive deal at the end of 2022, which required us to update all of the data on the private side to make sure that all of our protocols were still accurate. Some things change, most things don't. It's the most general way I could put it, which kind of feels like you wasted your money when you spend hundreds of thousands of dollars on a data update only to find that only a few nodes changed. But it's also encouraging because it's more proof that the industry is stuck in a fixed mindset and not as many things are shifting as people think. I would split it up into two forks. I would say from a logistical level, you got to pick a routine that you can stay consistent with. That's going to mitigate the cognitive dissonance that causes all the pressure that you're probably feeling on a day-to-day. So that would be just the logistical side. The other side that you're talking about is actually a strategic constraint. What should I be studying? What types of things should I be focusing on? And for that, I would say that you have to trust yourself to sense into how effective the study session feels. There was a point in my career when I stepped down from Run It Once and began sort of pioneering new methods. I remember it specifically. I was working with one Russian player at the time. We would meet every morning and we would node lock situations and try to find counter exploits that felt good. And it was the first time where I really felt inspired to go to that study session every day, because I'd play my session immediately after that study group. And I remember feeling like I had actionable upgrades that were improving my win rate every single day. Whatever that created in terms of a momentum and a confidence and a conviction was extremely important for my acceleration during that time. But I think it again comes down to this personal honesty of, are you willing to confess that you're not getting anything actionable out of your study session? If you cannot confess that, you're going to keep banging your head against the wall doing the things that you think are supposed to produce results. But if you're honest, you get into the session and you don't really have anything to grab onto. So a lot of this is about practicalizing the study session. Like, yeah, you're looking at a sim, but what's the actionable takeaway that you're going to be able to harness in game? Honesty is really, I think, what you need to be so sensitive to here. If you're honest with yourself, do you feel like you're bringing something over to the session today that's actionable? So that would be sort of my first principle for assessing whether or not the study session is actually valuable. From there, I think you need to use discernment and decide what path am I actually compatible with at this stage in my career. You're about to go play 500,000 more hands. Any player who's listening to this, you're about to go do that. It might take you a year or two, but if you're a pro, that is what's coming. What you should be most focused on right now, after hearing this, is what is the path that I'm going to use to get there? Because most players do not spend enough time deciding on what strategy they're going to implement before biting off a huge chunk of volume. And I think it's the biggest shame, because you can intelligently approach your career from a risk-adjusted lens. By risk-adjusted, I mean get the strategy that's going to give you the highest chance of arriving at high stakes, if you care about that. If you don't care about reliability and maximizing the chance that you're going to get to high stakes, which also maximizes the probability that you're going to have an outside return, because the faster you get to high stakes, the faster your compounds kick in. But if you don't care about that, if you're someone who chose poker because you want to be a free spirit and it matters more to you to take an instinctual path, even if it means it's lower reliability, which it objectively is. Players who take an instinctual path from small stakes fail at a much higher rate than players who adopt data-driven strategies. Just facts at this point. If you like that, though, if that's worth the gamble for you, clarify that up front, because that's going to help you adopt a strategy, whether or not you find it out in the industry and it exists and you just plug into another coach with that system, or whether or not you create your own. You need to clarify that first and own that decision so that you can approach the next 500,000 hands from a conviction that I made a conscious choice for what path I set out on. The data-driven path happens to be for people who prefer reliability more than they prefer having, the privilege to wander all over the game tree without any accountability to objective review. The data-driven system, in my opinion, maximizes a player's chance of getting from small stakes to high stakes. I would say within 2 to 3 years, the calcs on our side, with our average win rate being 5 BBs per 100 across all major sites and stakes, if you look at those calcs and use, standard bankroll management, there is a 90% chance or greater that you are going to arrive at high stakes within 2 years. At 3 years, it's almost probably a certainty, unless you're doing something really wrong. You can never be totally certain because there's always going to be risk of ruin and variance, but you can get pretty damn close. When you look at your career in a risk-adjusted way like that, what you start to see over longer time horizons is that maximizing the probability or rate at which you can get to high stakes is the biggest factor in generating a large outside return, 100x return on your initial bankroll investment, or 1,000x return, because all the money is made at high stakes. So what you should be concerned about when you're picking your small stake strategy, or if you're someone who's not performing well at mid stakes and high stakes and needs a new strategy potentially, you should be thinking, what is the strategy I can adopt that will give me a significant win rate at high stakes at the highest probability? Because that is the strategy that's going to allow you to get faster compound returns. And from a business-oriented perspective, which is what any poker player is, you're an entrepreneur in your own way. That is how you assess the implied value of a business endeavor. I don't think poker players are trained to think about it like this. And I think it's the main reason why the data-driven strategy is still unpopular. Meanwhile, all other sports arenas have already adopted data-driven strategies. The NFL has started going for it for 4th and down for a decade now. On 4th and short, they go for it because the data says go for it. It makes sense. It's incentivized. Watch that movie Moneyball, where the Oakland Athletics were able to draft a team of undervalued players just by looking at the data and seeing who got on base more frequently. There's all these examples in other sports arenas of data-driven strategies just crushing it. Poker's probably 20 years behind. I would say only 5 to 10% of the market are even available to the idea of data-driven strategies, and the ones that are compatible with it is even fewer, because the humility that it takes to persevere in a direction that isn't giving you immediate rewards, specifically because poker has variance and the feedback loops are long, it makes it very difficult. It's definitely not for the weak of heart. But that's why I emphasize this up front, that if you're a player who's at a crossroads and you're wondering if this is really a career that you're ready to pursue, willing to pursue, have that week to 2 week long period where you drop everything and really assess your strategy through a risk-adjusted lens. What is important to you? Is this a gamble that you want to take to go create your own strategy on instincts? Is it that important to you, or is it more important for you to safely amass a bankroll and perhaps just live a nice life? I always try to end this conversation by saying I really don't think there's a right or wrong answer. I just feel like identifying where you are in terms of compatibility with a certain method is the most important thing you can do before you just launch ahead and play 500,000 hands with no real consciousness, no real self-awareness over what you're getting yourself involved in. So it took me a long time, I think, to arrive at an elegant frame for the fact that there are data-driven strategies and there are basically everything else. But the way that I try to express that now, it is a compatibility issue. Data-driven strategies are for people that prefer clear, reproducible decision-making processes and that don't want to have to rely on instincts. Everything else is for people who want to potentially use instincts to fill in the blanks of otherwise unclear instruction or feedback. You can do it that way, but you're going to need good instincts. And the thing I always tell small stakes players is if you've been struggling at small stakes for some time, it's unlikely that you have good instincts. Why? Because someone with good instincts would be making much more money than you. Hard truth, but a truth I had to arrive at before I dropped everything and went down the data-driven approach. And like I said, that's an emotional leverage point for some people. The guy that we love the most is the guy who's hit a true rock bottom. It's like, I'm desperate. I've tried everything. I just need to make money now. I'm over all of the ego part of this career. It's not important to me to do it my way. Just show me how to make this a safe living. We love that guy.